My brother Cameron and I have always had this tradition of going on a camping trip at least once a year. No camping parks or overly frequented places. We like the idea of getting away from it all, turning off our phones, and spending a few days surrounded solely by nature. This time, he chose the location, a remote area on the East Coast, far enough away that no one else would be around. It required hiking a steep trail for nearly 2 hours to get there, which meant we'd have complete privacy. At least, that's what we thought. At first, everything seemed normal. We found a good spot near a small stream and began setting up camp. But soon I started noticing some strange things. There was a hiking stick lying near the trail, as if someone had forgotten it there. Further along, a pair of old, dirty, but still relatively intact shoes rested near a tree. I thought it was odd, but Cameron shrugged, saying that probably someone had passed by and left them behind. What bothered me was that the place was too remote for someone to simply discard things like that. Still, we pressed on, finished setting up the tent, and lit a campfire for the night. The night began peacefully. We made our impromptu dinner over the fire, chatted about nothing in particular, and laughed about old memories. I tried to ignore the strange feeling that had lingered since we found those discarded objects on the trail. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, while I was tossing another piece of wood onto the fire, something caught my attention in the darkness. A small point of light flickered distantly among the trees. At first, I thought it was a reflection or even a moonbeam piercing through the dense canopy, but the longer I looked, the more I realized it was a fire. And the problem was that it didn't seem to be in a place appropriate for camping. It must be another camper, Cameron said, not giving it much thought. That made sense. Some people might want to be completely isolated, just like us. But something bothered me. We hadn't seen anyone on the trail all day, nor any recent signs of human activity. Moreover, the position of the fire didn't seem natural. It was as if it were in the middle of an enclosed area, where there shouldn't be enough space for a camp. I stared for a while, waiting to see a silhouette moving around the fire, but nothing happened. No shadow, no sound of conversation, nothing. Just the fire burning silently in the dark. I tried to ignore it and carried on with the night as usual, but that distant fire wouldn't leave my mind. A few hours passed, and Cameron had already gone to sleep, while I remained awake, listening to the crackling of the fire and the sounds of the forest around me. At some point, sleep began to overcome me, and I decided to lie down as well. I don't know how long I slept, but I suddenly woke up with the urge to urinate. Our campfire's flames were low now, only a few embers glowing faintly. I lazily got up, grabbed my flashlight, and left the tent. That's when I realized that the other campfire, that distant one, was still burning. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Between me and the distant fire, there was something, or rather, someone. Not just one person, but several. Shadowy figures scattered throughout the forest, motionless. It was hard to tell how many there were at first, but as my vision adjusted, I realized there were many, all standing among the trees. The worst part was that they weren't looking at the fire. They were facing me. My heart raced, and for a second, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but I knew it wasn't. They were there. I was completely paralyzed. My legs locked, and a chill took over my body in a way I had never felt before. I wanted to convince myself it was just a play of shadows, perhaps tree trunks forming strange shapes, but I knew that wasn't it. There were human silhouettes, tall and thin, with no perceptible movement. You couldn't see faces, nor clothes, only their presence there, as if they were silently watching me. The only thing that moved was the distant fire, flickering and casting even more distorted shadows around. My breathing became shallow, and my hands started sweating. Without taking my eyes off those figures, I took a step back, then another. As soon as I turned to run back to the tent, I heard a dry snap in the forest, like a branch breaking. My chest froze. It was enough for me to bolt, stumbling in my haste to unzip the tent. I got in any which way and shook Cameron awake forcefully. "Wake up. There's someone here," he mumbled drowsily, but my desperation soon made him sit up abruptly. "What's going on?" he asked, still confused. "There are people out there," I whispered, trying to keep my voice low, but unable to hide the panic. Cameron finally stepped out of the tent, still a bit groggy, but as soon as he looked in the direction I pointed, his body stiffened immediately. I saw his face change, the sleepy expression turning into pure terror. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, almost breathless. The figures were still there, but now they were closer. They made no sound, didn't move in any perceptible way, just standing there, scattered among the trees, watching us. Cameron gave me a look, and I understood what he meant without words. This wasn't normal. These were not ordinary people. We had to get out there. Now, we didn't think of anything other than running. We grabbed only the car keys and our wallets, with no time to take down the tent or save any equipment. As we hurried away, I avoided looking back at the forest, but Cameron couldn't help himself. "They're closer," he said, and I felt my stomach drop. I quickened my pace, ignoring the branches scratching my arms and legs. It didn't matter. We had to reach the car. The only problem was that the path was long, and the one thing that terrified me more than those figures was the idea that they might follow us. The trail seemed much longer than we remembered. Our feet slipped on the loose earth, and the sound of our labored breathing mixed with the crunch of dry leaves under our hasty steps. I didn't want to look back, but every few meters, I felt that desperate need to know if we were still being followed. When I finally mustered the courage to turn my head, I almost tripped. The figures were still there. They weren't running or advancing in any perceptible way, but they seemed to be keeping pace with us. Always at the same distance, always hidden among the trees, as if they knew exactly how far they could go without us being able to see their faces. Cameron noticed too. "Man, this makes no sense," he muttered through gritted teeth, trying to stay calm, but his voice trembled. I didn't reply. There was nothing to be said. Our only option was to keep running and hope they wouldn't follow us to the car. The trail made sharp turns, and with every twist, I hoped not to see those silhouettes again. But they were still there, always there, motionless for a moment, and then, somehow, a little closer on the next bend, as if the space between us was shrinking. When we finally caught sight of the car, I felt a wave of relief mixed with despair. We didn't slow our pace until we were right beside it, and Cameron almost dropped the keys trying to unlock the doors. We got in as best as we could, slammed the doors, and locked everything up. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I turned on the headlights, illuminating the dirt road ahead of us, and it was only then that I realized the figures weren't there. None of them had left the forest. For a moment, we just sat in the car, panting, unable to process what had just happened. But when I looked in the rear-view mirror, I saw something that made my skin crawl once again. The distant campfire was still burning, steady and silent, as if we had never left. The next day, we tried to report what had happened to the local police, but we were met with skeptical looks and questions that made it clear they didn't believe a word we said. Maybe they were just other campers, the officer suggested, as if we were exaggerating. Or shadows of the trees. But we knew it wasn't that. I asked if anyone had ever reported anything strange in that area before, but he denied it. There were no records, no clues, no explanation. And that was what bothered me the most. If someone had gone through that before, perhaps they never managed to get out to tell the story. I'd always loved camping, but until then, I had never done it completely alone. I'd always gone with friends or family, but this time I decided I wanted to experience the solitude of nature. I chose a remote lake in northern Minnesota, a place I already knew and where I felt comfortable. The hike there took about 2 hours, but the route was easy, just a narrow trail cutting through the dense forest. I arrived in the late afternoon, set up my camp near the shore, and spent some time relaxing. The environment was exactly what I wanted: calm, quiet, and isolated. The afternoon passed without any issues. I spent some time sitting by the lake, listening to the sound of the water and the birds. I made a simple meal and enjoyed that moment of total disconnection. When the sun began to set, the air grew colder and the forest started to change. I had always found it fascinating how nature takes on a different tone at night, as if an invisible veil separated day from darkness. But as the night fully fell, I began to feel something strange. It was a feeling hard to explain. It wasn't exactly fear, but an unease, as if something were there with me, as if I were being watched. I tried to ignore that feeling. I had read before that the mind can play tricks on you when you're alone in nature, especially in such an isolated setting. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, that sense of being watched wouldn't go away. I lit my campfire and stayed close to it, hoping that the warmth and light would help me relax. From time to time, I glanced into the darkness around me, trying to see something among the trees, but I saw nothing. Just the thick darkness of the forest and the occasional sounds of insects and the wind rustling the branches. Still, the feeling persisted. It wasn't until later that night that something truly happened. I was already in the tent, lying in my sleeping bag, when I heard a loud, sharp noise coming from the forest. The snap of a thick branch breaking. It wasn't a common sound, like a small animal moving through the leaves. It was too loud, too heavy, as if something or someone had stepped directly on it. My body froze instantly. I held my breath, waiting to hear something more. But nothing came. No sound of footsteps, no rustling in the bushes, just the absolute silence after that single snap. My heart was beating so loudly, I could hear it in my ears. I remained motionless in the tent, waiting for any other sound to confirm that it was just an animal passing by. But the silence was oppressive. The forest was never completely silent. There were always the sounds of crickets, the wind, the water in the lake. But now, everything seemed contained, as if the environment itself was holding its breath along with me. I grabbed my bear spray and my flashlight, trying to decide what to do. If it were an animal, it would have moved by now. If it were a person, why wasn't he saying anything? Why wasn't there any other sound? I took a deep breath and mustered the courage to leave the tent. The campfire was already weak, just embers glowing in the dark. I turned on my flashlight and shone it in the direction from which the noise had come. Nothing. Just trees and motionless bushes. The ground covered in dry leaves seemed undisturbed. I took a few more steps, sweeping the light around, and then I called out, "Is anyone there?" My voice sounded weak, and I realized at that moment how vulnerable I truly was. I waited, but no answer came. Just that suffocating silence, as if something, or someone, was there but refused to reveal itself. I returned to the campfire, trying to convince myself that there was nothing there. Maybe an old branch had fallen on its own. Maybe it was just an animal, and I was letting my imagination run wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. My entire body was still tense, as if something inside me knew that danger was still near. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight tightly, and stayed there for a while, simply watching the darkness. Then, when I was about to head back into the tent, I decided to do one more quick sweep with the flashlight around. That's when I saw it. The moment the light passed through a denser part of the forest, a tall man appeared at the edge of the beam. He was standing there, completely motionless, watching me. My mind took a moment to process what I was seeing, because he didn't seem to fit into the landscape. It was as if he was simply there, waiting. Before I could react, he moved. Not toward me, but out of the flashlight's reach, disappearing back into the darkness. My heart stopped. How long had he been there? How many hours had I been sitting, unaware that someone was watching me in the middle of the forest? A wave of terror surged through me, and I immediately knew I couldn't stay there another second. My first reaction was to run and grab my things, but deep down, I already knew there wasn't time for that. That man was in the darkness, hidden somewhere among the trees, and I had no idea what he wanted. If he were someone lost or a hunter, why hadn't he said anything? Why had he just stayed there, watching? My hands trembled as I grabbed my flashlight and threw it back into the tent, taking only the car keys and my wallet. My body felt like it would collapse from fear, but my instinct screamed that I needed to get out of there. I began to leave the campsite without looking back. My breathing was heavy, and my steps were quick yet measured. I didn't want to run immediately. Running would mean I was terrified. And if he was watching me from somewhere, I didn't want to give the impression that I was prey. I followed the trail as fast as I could, listening to every sound around me, expecting at any moment for something to move behind me. But just as before, the silence was absolute. That only made me even more terrified. Hearing nothing meant that he was still there, standing in the darkness, watching. When I finally spotted my car among the trees, a part of me wanted to collapse in relief, but fear still guided me. Every step toward the door felt like a test of endurance, as if at any moment I would hear footsteps behind me, something moving quickly to catch up. My hands trembled so much that I nearly dropped the keys while trying to unlock the door. As soon as I managed to get in, I slammed the door and locked all the locks. I turned on the headlights, illuminating the empty road and the edge of the forest. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, my eyes went straight to the rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. At the edge of the forest, right where the headlight's beam began to fade, he was there. The same man, tall, motionless, watching. I couldn't see his face, only his rigid, inhuman silhouette against the darkness of the trees. He wasn't running, wasn't trying to catch up with me. He was just there, exactly as before, as if he wanted me to know that he was still watching me. My muscles locked for a second, an irrational part of my mind trying to understand whether this was really happening or if I was already delirious with terror. But it wasn't my imagination. He was there, and he knew I could see him. My throat was dry, my body paralyzed, but my instinct screamed louder. I started the car and sped away as if my life depended on it. I only glanced back one last time when I was already far away, and the forest looked just the same, empty, quiet, as if nothing had happened. I stayed awake the entire night after that. Every shadow on my bedroom wall reminded me of the silhouette standing in the forest. I tried to rationalize, to think of logical explanations. If he were a criminal, why didn't he attack immediately? If he were just a drifter, why did he remain silent, standing there in the dark, watching? What scares me the most isn't the fact that he was there. It's the fact that he did nothing. He just waited, watching me, as if he were analyzing me. Since that night, I've never been able to camp alone again. Not because I'm afraid of animals or getting lost, but because every time I'm in the forest, even in a group, that feeling of being watched never leaves me.